Hey guys! Tonight we begin with a gentle drift through a rather peculiar corner of history, one that smells faintly of jasmine, moonlight, and slightly damp soil. So dim the lights, fluff your pillows, and maybe take a sip of something warm. Because we're about to wander into a garden that never fully wakes, where the flowers seem to whisper secrets only the night can hear. This garden, if you can even call it that without raising an eyebrow, belonged to a very private sort of noble family. You know the type: silver spoons, golden chandeliers, and the kind of ancient wealth that makes you think, maybe I should have paid more attention in math class. The Moon Garden, as it would later be called, earned its name not because of any particularly innovative horticulture, though there were some charmingly strange plants, but because the owner had a fascination with night. Or perhaps he just didn't like people very much. The line is a bit blurry. Our story begins with Lord Percival Thorne, a man who inherited both his wealth and a rather inconvenient genetic predisposition toward insomnia. He was a quiet sort of fellow, not unlike someone you might meet at a library who smells faintly of old parchment and lavender. Percival had a habit of wandering outside in the darkest hours, muttering to himself about which plants were awake and which were merely pretending. Of course, he was deeply aware that plants don't actually sleep. But why let a little thing like science interfere with poetic musings? Percival's moon garden was a curiosity in itself. It had winding paths that seemed entirely unnecessary, and fountains that were never really turned on because the gardener, another character we'll meet later, was perpetually too tired to deal with plumbing. There were flowers that glowed faintly under the moon, and others that apparently smelled only slightly of regret. Of course, one might say that everything in Percival's garden smelled faintly of regret, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. Now, Lord Percival was not alone in his fascination with nocturnal flora. His sister Celeste shared his insomnia, though in a more dramatic and emotional fashion. While Percival preferred quiet observation and whispered conversations with plants, Celeste preferred pacing and poetry. She would wander the paths at night, scribbling in journals that smelled faintly of ink and disappointment. There's something oddly comforting about a sibling rivalry that doesn't involve swords or politics, just the occasional sigh and the muffled sound of someone dropping a fountain pen into a pond. Celeste had a curious habit of naming all the plants after tragic figures from history. There was Napoleon's dandelion, a flower that refused to grow taller than 3 inches, apparently because it identified too much with lost ambition. There was Marie Antoinette's lavender, which smelled faintly of cake, though why it smelled of cake nobody could quite explain. And there was, my personal favorite, Edward the Confused tulip, a plant that grew sideways because it could never quite decide where it wanted to be. I imagine you could almost hear the tulip sigh each night, though that might just be poetic license. Percival and Celeste's fascination with the moon garden wasn't merely about the plants. It was about the hours between dusk and dawn, the long, quiet stretches where the world outside seemed to hold its breath. You see, during these hours they felt free. Free from society, free from polite conversation, free from people who thought it was reasonable to eat breakfast before 10 a.m. or to expect you to appear at social gatherings that serve cold soup and stale bread. There's a subtle kind of madness that can grow in such an environment. Not the loud, chaotic type you see in movies, but a slow, creeping sort of oddness, like mold quietly taking over a forgotten corner of the attic. Percival developed a system for speaking to the moonflowers, which involved a lot of very polite nodding and occasional whispers like, "Yes, I see. You too are tired of the world." Celeste, on the other hand, composed sonnets to the night-blooming jasmine, which may have been beautiful, but also probably contributed to a mild headache when read aloud at 3 a.m. Their nocturnal lives attracted attention, naturally. The neighbors whispered, though only after dark, because no one in the village wanted to be seen admitting they were awake this late. Some believed the garden was cursed. Others believed it was enchanted. A few who were brave or foolish enough suggested it was just a bit eccentric, which, let's be honest, was probably closest to the truth. But rumors are far more fun when they involve shadowy figures, faint music, and the occasional inexplicable disappearance of the local cats. One might assume that living in a garden that only truly exists at night would lead to grand adventures, or at least minor intrigue. And while there were occasional minor adventures, like when Percival's hat got caught in the trellis, or when Celeste accidentally mistook a particularly grumpy owl for a garden gnome, the real story was quieter. It was the kind of quiet that makes your eyelids heavy and your thoughts wander, which, if you're still awake, is exactly the right kind of story to listen to. Now, let's float over to another part of the garden, where we encounter the gardener himself, Mr. Barnaby Crick. Barnaby was a man who had once aspired to grandeur, but had settled for moonlight and mild neglect. He wasn't particularly good at anything, though he claimed he had once tamed a sunflower into submission, which I assume is a euphemism. Barnaby's responsibilities included watering plants, tending to weeds, and most critically, not falling asleep while standing upright. Somehow, he managed all three tasks in varying degrees of success. Barnaby had a particular fondness for telling stories to the plants, though he claimed it was to keep their spirits high. In reality, he may have been talking to himself. He would pace the paths at night, narrating long-winded tales of distant kingdoms, tragic monarchs, and slightly disreputable courtiers. There was something hypnotic about his voice, a low monotone that made even the most restless minds start to drift. I suspect the garden thrived on the gentle sound of his narration. Or perhaps it merely tolerated it, which is probably more accurate. One evening, as the moon hung low and the garden shimmered faintly in its silver light, Percival and Celeste decided to host a midnight council. The council was composed entirely of themselves, though they pretended there were other attendees, including a very judgmental rosebush named Henrietta. The agenda involved deciding which plants would be allowed to bloom next, and whether the moon should be asked politely to shine brighter. I think we can agree that this was a typical sort of activity for them, entirely unnecessary, mildly whimsical, and deeply soothing. As the night stretched on, the siblings wandered to the heart of the garden, where the oldest tree stood. This tree had witnessed more awkward family dinners, questionable poetry, and faintly tragic romances than anyone could count. Its branches reached lazily toward the sky, as though even it preferred to nap rather than exert itself. They would sit beneath it, leaning against the trunk, and speak softly about the events of the day. Sometimes they spoke to each other, sometimes to the tree, and occasionally just to the dark air around them, which was surprisingly receptive. And so the nights went. The garden, perched somewhere between reality and imagination, became a sanctuary not just for Percival and Celeste, but for anyone who might wander by in the faint hours of the night. It was a place where insomnia wasn't a curse, but a companion, where the moonlight was neither harsh nor judgmental, where the whispers of the jasmine and the slow breathing of the ancient trees lulled even the most stubbornly awake minds toward sleep. Now, if you're still listening, chances are your own eyes might be growing heavy. Perhaps you can imagine the soft rustle of leaves, the faint perfume of night-blooming flowers, and the gentle, slightly awkward footsteps of two insomniacs wandering a garden that only exists when the world is silent. Picture the moon above, faint and reassuring, like a calm friend who doesn't demand conversation, only presence. And somewhere just beyond your hearing, perhaps a distant owl sighs or Barnaby Crick mutters another story to a particularly grumpy tulip. And with that, we can gently let part one drift to a close. There's no need to rush, no urgency, no dramatic climax. Just the soft, continuous hum of night, the quiet companionship of plants and moonlight, and the realization that sometimes the most fascinating histories are the ones whispered softly in the dark to no one in particular. In the dark to no one in particular.